Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video number 398. We've got Psyops, Operation Northwoods, MKUltra, the Tuskegee Syphilis experiments, and things of that nature. Conspiracies. Originally labeled conspiracy theories, generally speaking. You'll probably note that there's a reason why I'm covering this particular topic, and not just because I was prompted to do so. The other day I asked about, what people would like me to cover in occult videos, and I note that about half of those topics that people were feeding me, I've already done videos on them, so, you might want to go back through the occult playlist on my channel. There's almost 400 videos in it now, so it'll take a little time, I think. Psyops exist. They're sometimes reckoned to be a conspiracy theory, but they do exist. I'm familiar with several individuals who were adjacent to Psyops in the 1980s, actually. Sometimes these are good things. For example, attempting to woo the population away from communism or something like that. These days seems to go in the other direction. I see that as a negative thing. Psychological operations, though, are a literal branch of U.S. military. That is that trying to fuck with your enemy's mind is usually a good idea. Getting them, if they know less, if they are confused, they make mistakes. And you can take advantage of that. It has military applications. The idea that the U.S. military and intel agencies don't engage in psyops would be its own conspiracy theory. In fact, I would say they weren't doing their job if they didn't engage in psychological warfare. The problem is that in some cases it's directed at the U.S. public. And I don't like the idea of a government messing around with the minds of its own citizens. I'm a libertarian, small l, classical liberal, whatever. And so it makes me uncomfortable to think that that's happening. But it is happening. Now, as people will look at some of these examples that I'll talk about, I'll describe, like MKUltra and these others, describe them in brief. They'll look back at the past and they'll say, oh, the government did terrible things, interning Japanese citizens for no reason, and giving people syphilis on purpose, and terrible things. But any modern example you give them, their eyes glaze over, they get cognitive dissonance, and they don't believe that it's true, and they call you a conspiracy theorist. So they'll admit that conspiracy was real 50 years ago or 30 years ago. They won't admit that there's any modern conspiracy going on. The government would never false flag. That would never happen. Maybe in another country that would happen, but it can't happen here. People have a normalcy bias, so to speak, where they think it can't happen here. Can't happen to me and can't happen in my country because my country is just so above board and everything's perfectly kosher and wonderful. But that's cognitive dissonance. It's a lie that they're telling themselves because they don't want to admit to the alternative, which is that, yes, the government represents, suppose, this is the best case scenario. Assume your government is not malevolent. It's managing hundreds of millions of people. Assume that it's trying to do its best to actually secure wealth and prosperity for its people. Occasionally that happens. It depends on the administration in the country. Some are better than others. They have a better track record. Like Switzerland, more innocuous. Or the Dutch or something. U.S. government, Soviets, something like that, gets a little dirtier. North Korea or something like that. Everyone admits that they conduct psyops all the time. East Germany, they used to do like creepy crawling. We'll talk about that as well. Everyone doesn't want to admit to that. If it's an older example, they'll admit to it. Let's look at some of these examples. MKUltra. MKUltra, originally considered to be a conspiracy theory, well, it doesn't actually exist, is now known to have existed as a series of experiments and so forth by the U.S. government back during the nuclear era. In which the U.S. government experimented with giving soldiers drugs. It did tests on people in an asylum setting, human experiments of various kinds, psychological operations, etc. Part of this made sense. Attempting to build a better soldier so that you're more effective on the battlefield against communism made sense. And there were, of course, many foibles involved. There's a famous footage of a group of soldiers that they gave LSD to, and they said, well, let's see if this potentiates them in battle. Maybe it'll work. I think that the scientists that were ordered to conduct the experiment probably thought that the top brass there was a little loopy for even bothering to try with a drug like LSD. Not necessarily going to make you more likely to shoot somebody. It's more likely to make you stare at flowers for the next couple of hours. And they're wandering around in the fields and stuff, and they're grinning and falling over and falling asleep and like laughing and shit like that. And that experiment was a failure. It did lead to the rise of other substances being used, though. They were experimenting with various vitamin mixes and developing things. It was an era of great technological and medical progress, but it has a darker side too, because some of the experimentations there was no voluntary consent given. And it involved, allegedly, and I believe this, human abductions as well. Test some people. We'll get into some of these other things, and we'll show the dark side of the United States, especially during the Cold War period. Again, people think, well, the Cold War's over. The U.S. government doesn't do anything like that now. Bull fucking shit. Most of the major players in the world conduct human experimentation. There are abductions. Where do you think some of those kids that disappeared when they came across the border went? It ain't just trafficking rings. There's even darker stuff going on, by the way. Operation Northwoods. This was a proposal by certain people in the government and military back under JFK, actually, and he put the kibosh to it. So again, there's a reason why, while I didn't like all of JFK's ideological principles, and his personality at times could be a little weird, and his fucking Marilyn Monroe, and then his brother got sloppy seconds, and that's a little bit creepy. And then they killed her to cover it up, basically. While the Kennedys have some problems, he did stop Operation Northwoods. It would have been a massacre in which a bunch of U.S. citizens and military bases were hit with terrorist attacks that would then be blamed on Cuba. And he didn't want to go through with this. Might be one of the reasons why he died so early. The idea was to false flag the Cubans in order to stage an invasion. The idea was that the Soviets would not dare to intervene at that point to defend their ally, because the United States would have a cause to invade the island, saying, look, you know, they attacked military installations, they slaughtered this whole town full of people, and here's the evidence that it was Cuban communists that did it. We're going in. Fucking try to stop us. That was the basic principle. They were willing to sacrifice thousands of American lives in order to get this pulled off. Now, we would like, if we're arguing devil's advocate, and trust me, I'm not, if you argue any benevolence in this, it's the idea that a government can only look out for the benefit of the people at large, as a group, a homogenized total, or a subtotal. Therefore, it cannot count the value of an individual, unless it's a high-profile individual, so a major figure, like a main academic, someone who's famous, something like that. The little people, therefore, have to, of necessity, be expendable if a greater good is achieved by killing them, even if you're killing your own people. Normally, what you get with false flags, or pseudo-false flags, is the government knows that some other entity is going to attack people and allows it to happen for some cause or another. 9/11. Pearl Harbor. I'm not making any allegations. I'm just saying there are interesting questions to be asked about certain things that have happened over the last 100 years. Like the Reichstag fire. We're not sure that the Nazis torched the Reichstag in order to false flag. It could have very well been communists, but it's probable that they had some advanced warning, considering their intel networks said, well, that'll be convenient. You can always build another Reichstag, and just make sure that all the major paperwork is out of there before that flame is kindled. It'll be all fine. We'll let it happen. That's normally what happens. With Northwoods, it's worse, though. It wasn't, hey, we're going to let a foreign adversary attack us in order to attack them. It was more like, we're going to attack our own people and then blame it on the foreign adversary. By the way, one reason why JFK probably nixed it is he's like, well, you know, what happens if we're caught out in doing something like this? It might not have even been a genuine care about those people's lives. It may have been more strategic. Hey, I get where you're coming from, but this ain't the way to do it. I don't think it's going to work, and I really don't want to get removed from office, so, you know, take this plan and shove it up your ass. What about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where they infected hundreds of people with syphilis without their consent? They did it knowingly in order to experiment on treatments for syphilis. While you helped develop treatments for syphilis, you also sickened and killed a bunch of people. The U.S. government has done, the medical apparatus does this, militaries do this, state actors in general do this, intel agencies and bureaus do this on a regular basis. And it continues to happen in the United States. So there are modern examples too, both alleged and generally known. You can look into those for yourself. That's a little bit beyond the purview of this particular video. I would like to point out that there are people out there that glow in the dark that are genuinely depraved and don't really value any individual human life outside of their own nuclear family or their close business associates and friend circle and stuff like that. They'd kill if they thought it would benefit them or the nation or something, they would sacrifice a dozen people. I have often thought that the Boston Marathon bombing was allowed to happen. I mean, you had intel for several years from foreign authorities that the Tsarnaev brothers were radicalized. We knew that. They physically, openly posted on public pages on Facebook and elsewhere about their love for Osama bin Laden, and yet somehow they were able to pull off the Boston Marathon bombing. It was very interesting. And then, of course, Boston gets completely locked down, and people's homes are raided, and they're kept in their homes against their will. And you have that famous image of the police officer carrying the milk to that one woman there because she couldn't go out to the store. And it was moronic, actually. They should have, with the Intel network being as beefy as it is, they should have understood the Tsarnaevs should be on a watch list, like a literal one. And then you have probably one of the greatest examples. You remember how East Germany, in there, the KGB would show up, and they would go to someone's home. They're a dissident. And they would rearrange the furniture to screw with them. Now, you've got two choices when this happens. And by the way, it's possible the U.S. government does this too. Although I do notice there's an overlap between people claiming this and them being a little bit nuts. I think there are probably examples where stuff like this does still happen. They'd go in and rearrange the furniture. The dissident comes back, realizes someone's been in their house. What are you supposed to do? The authorities will jail you for sluggish schizophrenia if you complain. If you don't complain, they'll keep doing it. And you'll be ever-presently aware of the fact that people are coming into your house and moving things around, and there's nothing you can do about it. By the way, there's an interesting tie-in with the Manson family, actually. It's called creepy crawling. Charlie and his people used to do this too, and I think that he had a general understanding of psychological operations. Don't believe he was a cult leader. Don't believe that he was involved with the Tate murder and things like that. I've spoken of that before at length, and so you can go back and listen to my opinions of that. I think that the crime for which he was jailed, he was fundamentally not guilty of. But he did like to do home invasions. They did steal things, but they also occasionally would just rearrange the furniture East Germany style. And I think the idea was, hey, you didn't pay us for that mescaline, pony it up. Otherwise, Charlie and the family will be here every day when you're at work, and we're going to have a fun time. And by the way, if you complain about it, people are going to know that you're buying a bunch of mescaline, so you better pony up the money, because the next step is we break your kneecaps backwards. So, interesting topic. Where does the occult fit in? There are occultists, or rather pseudo-occultists, that have been involved with Psyops. Some of you probably know who I'm referring to. That's about all. Peace out.